At 37 years old, Martha Vance had reached the absolute end of her rope. Standing barefoot on the muddy banks of the Blackwood River, with nothing to her name save for a bruised pride and $12 silver sewn into the hem of her petticoat. It was her own ruthless brother-in-law, a land-hungry speculator named Thomas Sterling, who had cast her out from her ancestral homestead after her husband's death, claiming a forged debt that stripped her of every acre, every horse, and every brick her family had laid over 3 generations. Left with no place in the dry towns of the territory, Martha took her final remaining wealth, a single $quarter, and purchased an old, rotting wooden skiff from a drunkard at the dock, a craft so waterlogged and battered that the local townsfolk laughed aloud as she pushed off into the murky still waters. They called her a fool for rowing out toward the drowned ruins of St. Jude in the hollow, an old stone church that had sat partially submerged in the flooded valley for over 120 years, its bell tower rising like a lonely stone finger above the dark water. Yet deep beneath those stagnant depths, sealed within the waterlogged heart of the forgotten sanctuary, lay a long-buried secret that would not only rewrite the dark history of the entire county, but would strip the powerful of their unearned thrones and restore hope to a broken land. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Martha Vance, if you are listening from a quiet corner of the world that feels abandoned or forgotten. Leave a message in the comments below and share your piece of the earth with us today. Long before the waters came to swallow the lower valley, the Vance family had been people of the soil, bound to the dark, rich earth of the Drowned Basin by sweat, prayers, and 30 years of unyielding labor. Martha's father, a quiet timberman named Silas, had taught her early in life that the true worth of a human soul was measured by what she built when no one was watching, and by how firmly she held her tongue when lesser men tried to provoke her. In those early days, the valley was a green and golden paradise, nestled between the craggy shoulders of the Sawtooth Ridge, where wild clover grew waist-high and the rivers ran so clear you could count the polished pebbles on the riverbed 5 feet down. Martha had grown up with the smell of pine sawdust on her hands and the cool, damp breath of the morning fog on her cheeks, learning the patience that only a life close to nature can cultivate. She watched her father mend broken wagons with scraps of discarded iron, carving new spokes out of stubborn hickory, teaching her that nothing truly broken was beyond saving if one possessed the eyes to see its hidden line and the patience to work the wood. She was not a woman of many words, even as a girl, but her eyes were sharp, capable of picking out the silent shifts in the weather, or the subtle changes in a person's tone long before others caught the scent of trouble. When the great fever swept through the territory in the winter of her 19th year, taking both her mother and father within a fortnight of each other, Martha did not weep openly before the neighbors, nor did she falter in her daily chores. Instead, she rose before the dawn, wrapped herself in her father's oversized wool coat, and carried on the work of the farm, her silent devotion to the soil becoming the armor that kept her spirit from collapsing under the heavy weight of her grief. It was during those long, solitary years of her youth that Martha met William Vance, a gentle, soft-spoken carpenter whose hands were as calloused as her father's had been, but whose heart was as gentle as a spring rain. William had come to the valley with little more than a box of iron tools and an honest smile, seeking a piece of land where a man might build an honest life through the work of his own 2 hands. They were married in the small whitewashed chapel that sat on the high ridge overlooking the basin, with only a handful of local farmers present to witness their vows under the warm autumn sun. For nearly 2 decades, Martha and William lived a life of quiet grace, building a sturdy timber house, clearing 36 acres of stubborn oak stumps, and earning the deep, unprompted respect of every family residing within 10 miles of their gate. Though they were never blessed with children of their own, their home became a place of refuge for travelers lost along the timber trails, for widowed women needing a side of salted pork to survive the harsh winters, and for young farmhands looking for honest work and a fair wage. William possessed a rare talent for timber framing, crafting barns and bridges that seemed to defy the slow rot of time, while Martha kept the garden, cured the meats, and maintained a meticulously kept ledger that tracked every coin earned and every bushel of wheat sold at the river landing. Their life was not luxurious, nor did they ever crave the glitter of the larger boomtowns that were beginning to sprout up along the newly laid railroad lines 50 miles to the east. They were content with the scent of wood smoke, the steady tick of the tall grandfather clock in the parlor, and the knowledge that their names stood for absolute integrity in a world that was rapidly becoming obsessed with speed, speculation, and easy wealth. The peace that had sustained the valley for half a century began to crumble with the sudden arrival of Thomas Sterling, a slick-talking land agent from the capital who had married Martha's younger sister Clara 3 years prior. Sterling was a man whose eyes were always moving, searching the room for a weakness to exploit or an advantage to seize, wearing fine wool coats that smelled faintly of cheap cigars and stale whiskey. He saw the tranquil valley not as a community of hard-working families, but as a vast grid of paper deeds waiting to be consolidated, flipped, and sold to the mining consortiums that were hungrily expanding toward the mountains. William had always treated Sterling with a cool, measured, polite restraint, lending him small sums of money when Clara wrote desperate letters claiming their hearth was cold, but refusing to ever engage in Sterling's grand, suspicious investment schemes. Then came the brutal winter of 1888, a winter so cold that the birds froze in the limbs of the walnut trees and the river turned to solid blue ice 3 feet thick. William caught a deep, rattling chill in his chest while helping a neighbor shore up a collapsed barn roof in the middle of a blinding blizzard. And despite Martha's frantic efforts with warm poultices, herbal teas, and sleepless nights beside his bedside, his strength gave out just as the first spring thaws began to break the ice on the creek, with William's body barely laid to rest beneath the thawing sod of the family plot. Thomas Sterling descended upon the farm like a vulture scenting a fresh kill, armed with a briefcase full of legal documents and accompanied by the town's corrupt deputy sheriff. Sterling claimed that William had quietly signed over the entire farm as collateral for a series of massive loans to finance a failed timber venture up in the high country, producing yellowed papers bearing William's unmistakable, sloping signature at the bottom. Martha stared at the documents in utter disbelief, knowing in her heart that her husband would never have gambled their home or signed away their future without her knowledge. But the town judge was a close associate of Sterling's, and the law in those days favored paper deeds and wax seals over the word of a grieving widow. Within a month, the court ordered a forced seizure of the property, and Martha watched in helpless, silent horror as Sterling's men loaded her furniture onto a flatbed wagon, drove her milk cows down the road, and nailed a cold iron padlock onto the heavy oak door her husband had carved with his own hands. She was given less than an hour to pack a single canvas carpet bag with her clothes, her mother's silver thimble, and the few meager personal possessions she could carry on her back. Standing at the edge of the dust-choked turnpike, watching her brother-in-law spit onto the porch she had scrubbed every Saturday morning for 20 years, Martha realized she had been systematically stripped of her home, her reputation, and her history, left with nothing but 12 silver dollars hidden in her petticoat and the clothes on her back. Asterisk. Driven from the ridge with nowhere to turn, Martha walked 12 long miles down into the low-lying, swampy bottoms of the basin, where the land was deemed completely worthless by speculators and forgotten by the rest of the world. Decades earlier, a massive earthen dam built by an ill-fated canal company had burst at the narrow bend of the gorge, permanently flooding the lower valley floor and transforming what was once a fertile settlement into a vast, silent, mirror-like lake of stagnant, brownish-green water. The townsfolk called it the Drowned Basin, a dark and eerie expanse of flooded cypress trees, submerged fences, and ghostly remnants of homesteads that had been abandoned in a single night of terror over a century ago. Standing out in the absolute middle of this eerie liquid wilderness was the stone bell tower and slate roof of St. Jude in the hollow, an ancient church built by the very first pioneers who had settled the territory in the late 1700s. The church had sat partially submerged in 20 feet of calm, shadowed water for 120 years, its massive double doors hidden forever beneath the floodline, its high-arched stained-glass windows cracked and dark, standing like a forgotten tombstone for an era that everyone else had agreed to forget, reaching the edge of the stagnant water at the old river landing. Martha found a local river rat named Old Man Silas sitting on an overturned tub, gutting catfish with a rusted blade beside a half-sunken wooden skiff. The boat was a miserable waterlogged wreck made of graying pine planks, its oars mismatched and splintered, its floorboards thick with green slime and decaying oak leaves. Silas spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the water and laughed when Martha stepped forward, offering her last $quarter coin for the vessel, telling her that the boat wouldn't survive a single season on the water, and that only a half-mad woman would want to venture out into the haunted, snake-infested waters of the Drowned Valley. But Martha did not hesitate. She dropped the silver coin into the man's calloused palm, took hold of the splintered oars, and pushed her frail, creaking craft out onto the black, glassy surface of the floodwaters. As she rowed away from the shore, leaving the dry land and her cruel relatives behind, the silence of the drowned valley settled over her like a heavy, velvet blanket, broken only by the rhythmic splash of her oars and the distant, hollow cry of a solitary blue heron resting on a submerged fence post. She was a woman who had lost everything that the world deemed valuable. Yet as she looked across the water toward the dark silhouette of the stone chapel rising from the mist, a strange, quiet calm took root in her chest. Replacing the burning grief that had consumed her for months, rowing out toward the center of the lake was an arduous, exhausting trial for a woman unaccustomed to the heavy weight of waterlogged pine oars, her hands quickly blistering against the rough, unsanded wood as the skiff glided past the ghostly tops of dead willow trees. The air over the water was cool and thick with the scent of damp moss, silt, and ancient timber, a smell that reminded her of deep cellars and forgotten storm shelters. As she drew nearer to the submerged church of St. Jude in the hollow, its sheer physical scale became breathtaking. Built from massive blocks of local granite laid by hand over a century ago, the structure had defied the relentless erosion of the floodwaters, its heavy walls standing straight and true despite the decades of immersion. Martha maneuvered her small skiff through a gap where a magnificent rose window had long since lost its colored glass, sliding the wooden craft directly into the upper sanctuary of the church, which now served as an internal sheltered bay inside the stone ruins. Inside, the sun rays filtered down through the high, timber-board rafters in long dusty beams of golden light, illuminating the dark water that filled the nave like a cathedral pool, reflecting the intricate woodwork of the upper choir loft that had managed to remain high and dry above the floodline, securing her boat's rope to an iron bracket that had once held a bronze oil lamp. Martha pulled herself up onto the rotting planks of the elevated choir loft, her boots echoing loudly in the vast silent space. The loft was covered in a thick layer of dry bird droppings, bat dust, and dried oak leaves that had blown in through the broken roof tiles over the span of 100 years, preserving everything beneath it in a strange time capsule dryness. As she carefully explored the shadowed corners of the loft, holding her skirt clear of the debris, her foot struck something hard and metallic concealed beneath a pile of dry, rotted canvas that had once been an altar cloth. Kneeling down on the dusty floorboards, she brushed away the gray webs and grime, revealing a heavy, rectangular chest made of thick brass-bound oak, secured by a massive iron padlock that was deeply rusted but entirely intact. On the lid of the chest, etched into a tarnished brass plate, were the faint, elegant initials of the valley's original land company, a company that had vanished from all official records following the catastrophic dam breach of 1796. Her heart beating with a rapid thumping rhythm, Martha reached into her bag for her husband's old steel chisel, inserting the flat blade into the rusted clasp of the ancient padlock and striking it sharply with a heavy river stone she had brought from the shore. With a sharp, metallic snap that echoed like a gunshot through the silent stone rafters, the rusted lock yielded, and Martha slowly raised the heavy oak lid, releasing a dry puff of cedar dust and age-old paper into the quiet air. Inside the brass-bound chest, wrapped tightly in oil-soaked canvas that had miraculously warded off the moisture of 12 decades, lay no gold or glittering jewels, but something infinitely more valuable to a land torn apart by greed and slick lawyers. Beneath the canvas rested a pristine, leather-bound master survey ledger, its pages yellowed with age but filled with meticulous hand-drawn maps, sealed deeds, and government land grants bearing the official silver seals of the original territorial governor. As Martha carefully turned the crisp, rag-paper pages with trembling fingers, her eyes widened as she recognized the detailed boundary lines of the entire valley, drawn with an exacting precision that modern surveyors could only dream of achieving. But it was not merely the maps that caught her breath. Tucked inside the back cover of the ledger was a thick stack of personal letters and an official royal land decree signed before the founding of the state, explicitly declaring that the entire low-lying basin, including the high ridges surrounding it, was an unalienable, communal land trust designated solely for the permanent use of the valley's working settlers and their descendants. The decree explicitly stated that no individual, private speculator, or corporate entity could ever legally purchase, divide, or seize the lands of the basin through debt or tax foreclosures, as the original land patent had been permanently dedicated as a free, common farmstead trust in perpetuity. As Martha read through the elegant, faded ink of the 18th century legal documents, a second, even more shocking revelation came to light among the loose papers tucked between the ledger pages. Among the land grants was a series of private correspondence between the original land company, directors, and a prominent wealthy family of the era, a family whose direct descendant was none other than Thomas Sterling's own grandfather. The letters laid out in cold, calculating detail how the original Sterling family had deliberately sabotaged the earthen dam in 1796, intentionally flooding the lower settlement to force the original homesteaders off their rich farms, so that the family could later buy up the surrounding high ground for a fraction of its true value once the disaster was forgotten. The flood had not been an act of God or an unforeseen engineering failure. It had been a cold-blooded, criminal act of land theft, executed over a century prior and kept secret by hiding the true master land trust ledger inside the iron chest in the church tower just before the rising waters sealed the sanctuary doors forever. Martha sat back on her heels in the dusty choir loft, the weight of the discovery pressing against her chest like a heavy stone, realizing that every deed, every foreclosure, and every land claim executed by Thomas Sterling and his corrupt forebears for the last 3 generations was entirely fraudulent, illegal, and void under the supreme law of the original territorial grant. Asterisk. The quiet sanctuary seemed to hold its breath as Martha realized the immense, dangerous power that now rested in her mud-stained hands. She was no longer just an evicted widow hiding in a drowned church, but the sole keeper of the truth that could undo the entire kingdom of corruption Thomas Sterling had built upon the suffering of her neighbors. Wrapped carefully back in its protective oilskin, the ledger was a weapon of absolute truth. But Martha knew she could not simply march into the county courthouse and present it to the very judge who sat in Sterling's pocket and shared in his ill-gotten profits. She needed time strategy and absolute secrecy if she was to survive long enough to bring the documents before a federal circuit judge who was scheduled to arrive in the district, capital 50 miles away, at the end of the harvest season. For the next 3 weeks, Martha made the drowned choir loft her secret, hidden home. Sleeping on a bed of dry pine needles she hauled out in her skiff, eating salted fish she caught from the sanctuary window, and spending her days carefully copying every page map and signature from the master ledger using an old ink bottle and feather quill she found in the church rector's desk, while Martha worked in the cool shadow of the stone bell tower. Rumors began to circulate through the dry, dusty streets of the town that the mad widow Vance had lost her mind entirely, living out on the dark water like an old swamp witch, rowing her rotten $quarter boat back and forth between the submerged ruins and the shore under the cover of dusk. Thomas Sterling, now feeling completely unchallengeable in his power, had already begun deploying armed land marshals to evict a dozen more farming families from the eastern ridge, planning to clear the entire district to make way for a massive coal rail yard and timber mill. He laughed openly at the saloon when locals mentioned seeing Martha's small boat tied to the stone window of the drowned church, remarking that the swamp was the only fitting home for a woman who didn't know her place when the law had spoken. But Sterling's arrogant comfort was short-lived. One evening, as Martha rode silently near the edge of the river, bank to harvest wild watercress, she overheard 2 of Sterling's hired guards discussing how they had been ordered to set fire to the old wooden homes on the eastern ridge by the end of the week to force the reluctant families off the property before the federal judge arrived. Stakes had suddenly risen beyond her own personal survival. The lives, homes, and futures of her lifelong friends and neighbors were about to be consumed by the same ruthless fire that had destroyed her own world. Martha knew she could no longer wait for the circuit judge's scheduled arrival in the autumn. She had to act immediately, using the deep ancestral knowledge of the land her father had taught her decades ago. That very night, under the pale light of a sliver moon, Martha rowed her skiff out to the narrow, rocky mouth of the gorge, where the original breached dam had been patched over 80 years ago with massive wooden cribbing and heavy field stones to keep the basin permanently flooded and unusable for farming. Examining the ancient timber structure from her boat, her sharp eyes caught what others had missed for generations. The timber cribbing was not holding back an inexhaustible sea, but was merely acting as a crude artificial wedge that was jamming the natural, deep drainage channel of the valley floor. If that main timber keylog was removed or dislodged, the massive pressure of the impounded basin water would naturally force its way through the old stone channel, draining the flooded valley and revealing the rich, fertile floor that had been hidden beneath 20 feet of dark water for over a century. Using a heavy, iron crowbar she had salvaged from an abandoned blacksmith shop along the shore, Martha spent 3 exhausting, sleepless nights working in total dark water, silently prying away the rotten outer planks and clearing away the centuries' worth of river silt that locked the central keylog in place. Her hands were torn, her shoulders screamed with deep exhaustion, and the bitter cold of the deep water chilled her to the bone. But every time her strength began to flag, she saw the arrogant, sneering face of Thomas Sterling and remembered the quiet, honest eyes of her late husband William. On the 4th night, as a heavy summer thunderstorm began to roll over the Sawtooth Ridge, sending flashes of lightning across the dark sky and roaring thunder through the hills, Martha applied the full weight of her body to the lever, wedging the iron bar beneath the primary support beam of the old cribbing. With a sound like tearing thunder, the ancient timber cracked, shifted, and gave way under the massive, concentrated pressure of the impounded lake, releasing a roaring, churning torrent of white water down the foul. long-abandoned natural riverbed. Martha barely managed to scramble back into her skiff and row for the high ground of the church tower as the water level inside the basin began to drop with astonishing speed, swirling in great dark whirlpools as the river reclaimed its ancient natural channel. By the time the morning sun broke through the stormy clouds, painting the sky in brilliant shades of rose and gold, the impossible had occurred before the disbelieving eyes of the entire county. The great flooded lake that had covered the lower valley for 120 years was rapidly disappearing, receding like a vanishing dream, leaving behind thousands of acres of deep black, unbelievably rich bottomland soil that had been preserved, silt fertilized, and resting undisturbed since the 18th century. And there, standing high and dry on the newly exposed floor of the valley, rested the full magnificent stone structure of St. Jude in the hollow, its heavy double oak doors opening once again to the open air for the first time in over 4 generations. The sudden, dramatic drainage of the basin sent shockwaves of panic and utter confusion through the town, bringing dozens of bewildered farmers, merchants, and land agents rushing down to the edge of the newly exposed, steaming valley floor. At the head of the crowd rode Thomas Sterling, his face pale with a mixture of dark rage and sudden, unexplainable fear, surrounded by 4 armed marshals as he spurred his horse through the damp, rich silt toward the stone steps of the church. But as Sterling reached the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary, he stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat as the crowd of local settlers gathered behind him in absolute stunned silence. Standing on the top stone step of the church, framed by the soaring granite archway and bathed in the clean morning sunlight, was Martha Vance, holding the heavy brass-bound oak chest at her feet and carrying the original leather-bound master ledger tucked securely under her arm. Beside her stood the Honorable Judge Arthur Vance, no relation to William, but the High Federal Circuit Magistrate who had arrived early in the district, whom Martha had secretly contacted through a trusted young farmhand 3 days prior. In a voice that was clear, calm, and resonant as a brass bell, echoing across the silent valley floor so that every man, woman, and child present could hear every word. Martha began to read from the ancient ledger. She read the original territorial land trust decree, declaring that every acre of the valley belonged permanently and unalterably to the collective families who worked the soil, completely exempt from all private debt, mortgages, and corporate seizures. She then read the century-old letters, exposing the dark, criminal sabotage executed by Thomas Sterling's ancestors that had drowned the original settlement, and laid out the long paper trail of fraud, forgery, and illegal land grabs that Sterling had committed against her husband and every farmer in the county. The crowd of settlers listened in mounting, electrifying shock, their quiet despair turning into a surging wave of righteous anger as the absolute truth of their stolen lives was laid bare before the federal authority. Sterling tried frantically to shout down her words, brandishing his forged courthouse papers and ordering his marshals to seize the widow for destruction of property. But the federal judge stepped forward with his hand raised, backed by a troop of United States Marshals who had accompanied him from the Capitol. Asterisk. The legal hammer fell with swift, unyielding, and absolute justice. The federal judge immediately invalidated every deed claim and eviction notice Sterling had ever issued in the county, declaring the original territorial land trust to be the supreme absolute law of the basin. Thomas Sterling was arrested on the spot for massive land fraud, conspiracy, and historical destruction of public resources. His fine wool coat smeared with the very swamp mud he had forced his neighbors to live in, led away in iron wrist manacles to face a long federal prison sentence from which he would never return. The vast newly revealed valley floor was formally divided among the impoverished farming families of the district, giving every displaced widow, every struggling farmhand, and every cheated homesteader 30 acres of the richest, most fertile soil in the entire territory, completely free of debt or corporate control forever. Martha Vance did not take the largest plot, nor did she claim any monetary reward for her extraordinary courage. She took only her small, original family farm on the ridge, restored to her by federal decree, and a modest 3-acre plot surrounding the old stone church of St. Jude in the hollow, with the water gone. The old stone church was lovingly restored by the hands of 40 grateful men and women, who worked side by side throughout the bright autumn days, replacing the rotted roof beams, fitting clear glass into the soaring arched windows, and hanging a massive bronze bell in the high granite tower that could be heard for 20 miles across the green, thriving valley. Martha lived out the remainder of her long, peaceful days on her restored homestead, her door always unlatched, her table always set for anyone in need of a warm meal or a wise listening ear. She kept the old splintered pine skiff resting in the dry grass beside her garden gate, the leaky, rotting boat she had bought for a single $quarter when the world had written her off as broken and helpless. Travelers who passed through the prosperous, Golden Valley would often stop by her gate to look at the strange, crude craft and ask the quiet, white-haired woman why she kept such a worthless piece of junk on her manicured lawn. Martha would only smile her gentle, knowing smile, look out over the vast, green fields of clover that now filled the valley where the dark waters used to sit, and tell them that the most precious things in this life are often found hidden deep within the things that others have discarded as ruined. 37 years old, Martha Vance had reached what appeared to be the absolute end of her life, standing barefoot in the mud with $12 silver sewn into her dress, cast out by a world driven by cruel greed and cold arrogance. Yet through the quiet resilience of her spirit, her refusal to accept the lies of the powerful, and a stubborn faith in the ultimate justice of the truth, she took a worthless 25-cent boat into the dark waters of despair and pulled forth the redemption of an entire generation. She proved that no force on earth, no matter how rich or powerful, can permanently bury the truth, and that a single, brave soul willing to row into the quiet, forgotten places can change the course of history for everyone around her. Settle back now and let the quiet strength of Martha Vance remind you that your story is never truly over as long as you hold fast to what is right. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us today, listening to this tale of quiet resilience and restored justice from the American frontier. If this story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who might need a gentle reminder of their own worth, and subscribe to our channel to join our growing community of quiet listeners. Before you go, tell us in the comments below, what is a time in your own life when you found great value or hope in something that others had completely written off? Until next time, stay close, *.